Throughout history, human beings have fashioned beautiful objects from the materials of the earth. In all times and places, we have used our hands to express the passions of our hearts and the aspirations of our souls. Heeding some powerful inner force, we have channeled profound energies through our hands, creating works that speak across time and space and culture. Uniting the hands with the heart and soul was one of the highest aspirations of the arts and crafts movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The movement inspired a rich outpouring of furniture, pottery, metalwork, and textiles, as well as art and architecture. Among the American architects who rose to prominence during the arts and crafts era, two of the most celebrated were Charles and Henry Greene. To step into a home designed by the Greenes is to experience a marriage of art and craft that is deeply affecting.
Their architecture, I think, has a soul. You can see the love of nature, the love of craft, the love of sheer beauty. There's a kind of humanness and intimacy to their architecture that at once makes people feel at home in their houses.
It allows me to reflect on the people that put it together, that there was a man's hand that made this wall look the way it looks. And that is extremely powerful, and I think coming into a space that was created with so much human touch, that indeed touches all of us.
Major funding for Greene Greene, the Art of Architecture, has been provided by the Amundsen Foundation, the James Irvine Foundation, the Ayrshire Foundation, and the Joan Irvine Smith and Athley R. Clark Foundation. In the work that made them famous, Charles and Henry Greene took an intensely artistic approach to the design of houses and interiors, treating each residence as an individual work of art. They were not alone in this approach to architecture. The Greenes belonged to a generation of artist architects that exhibited a passionate interest in creating fully planned and integrated living environments. Their peers included Frank Lloyd Wright in the United States, C.F.A. Voysey in England, Charles Rennie Mackintosh in Scotland, and Joseph Maria Olbrich in Austria. The road that led the Greenes to the heights of residential architecture stretched across the United States. But the place where their ideas took root and flowered most profusely was Pasadena, a picturesque city nestled at the foot of the San Gabriel Mountains in Southern California. Charles and Henry Greene arrived in Pasadena in 1893, not long after receiving training in architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Both of the brothers were in their 20s, and they were coming to Pasadena at the encouragement of their parents, who had moved there a year earlier.
Already by 1893, there was something special happening here in Southern California, and in particular in the town of Pasadena. This had become, by the 1890s, one of the most popular winter resort towns in America. And I think for them, this must have been a very exciting place to be at a very exciting moment.
As a fashionable winter resort, Pasadena attracted a large number of wealthy visitors, many of whom built second homes there. This proved highly beneficial to enterprising architects like Charles and Henry Greene. As they explored the region on bicycle and on foot, they observed a landscape and culture that were very different from anything they had known before, either in the Midwest, where they grew up, or on the East Coast, where they studied architecture. "There is a charm about it that tempts one to try the new," Charles wrote. "Even when one comes with a host of traditions, one is apt to find it so different that one hesitates and at last stops to listen." Under the spell of their adopted home, Charles and Henry Greene began searching for an architectural language suited to the culture and landscape of Southern California. In 1901, the search took a surprising turn to the British Isles. That year, Charles Greene married an Englishwoman, Alice White. For their honeymoon, the couple took an extended tour of England and the continent.
Many different influences came to bear on the Greenes' work, but one of the most important early influences was the English arts and crafts movement. Some of the things that they probably saw included arts and crafts houses designed by CFA Voisey. He may have seen William Morris's work in London. Charles and Alice also went to Glasgow and would have seen the work of Charles Rennie Mackintosh at the 1901 exposition there.
The progressive Scottish architect cast a prominent shadow over Glasgow at that time. He had recently completed several major projects in the city, including the monumental Glasgow School of Art. The exposure to the arts and crafts movement that Charles Greene received in Scotland and England was reinforced later that year when the Craftsman magazine made its debut in October 1901. The magazine was the creation of Gustav Stickley, a manufacturer of craftsman-style furniture and an enthusiastic promoter of the arts and crafts movement in America.
The influence of the Craftsman magazine on Charles and Henry Greene was tremendous. Finally, there was an American publication that echoed the Studio magazine that came out of London that brought the world closer together. Charles Greene began to clip pictures out of the Craftsman magazine early on, but it wasn't too many years before their work was actually being published in the Craftsman.
Shortly after returning from their honeymoon, Charles and Alice purchased a lot on which to build their first home. They selected a picturesque site overlooking the Arroyo Seco in Pasadena.
Fortunately, what Charles felt about his experiences in England and Scotland and the continent during his honeymoon can be traced through the building of his own home.
The daring expressions he saw in Voisey's work there, the honest use of materials, the lack of applied decoration. I think those we see immediately in his own house when he arrives back in Pasadena.
His house was called Oakholm in recognition of the beautiful oak tree against which he sited his house. They were just a few feet apart from each other.
Responding to the topography and natural features of the site, Charles Greene created a residence that is at once rustic and refined, simple and sophisticated. As the Greene family grew in size, so too did Oakholm, evolving from a one-story house with 2 bedrooms into a rambling 4-level residence with 6 bedrooms. And with every addition and modification, Charles Greene discovered exciting new opportunities for experimentation.
As you walk through Charles Greene's house, you can identify details and craftsmanship that soon are found in the most notable large homes. And thus, Charles Greene's own house was a real experimental laboratory. Part of the evolution of the express timber structures, the large outriggers, emerged in the evolution of the house as it went up level by level by level.
Charles Greene's imagination found a whimsical outlet while he was working on the foundation and retaining walls for Oakholm. With a fine artistic eye and the disciplined hand of a sculptor, he carefully placed twisted clinker bricks among the cobblestones, creating an eccentric yet pleasing effect that soon became a staple in the green and green design vocabulary.
Charles Greene found thrown out from the local brickyards what were called clinker bricks, those that were too close to the furnaces and burned and twisted and turned dark colors and purple and black. So they began to take these and mix them with the cobblestones and created something akin to the work of Gaudí in Spain.
While Charles Greene was still working on Oakhome, an important new client approached the Greenes. His name was James Culbertson.
Culbertson was also already a great aficionado of the arts and crafts philosophies that were beginning to spread across the country. So Charles and Henry were faced with a tremendously sympathetic client.
On a site overlooking the Arroyo Seco, less than a block from Oakhome, the Greenes created a house for James Culbertson that would have seemed at home in the English countryside. It featured half-timber construction, a Tudor-style arched doorway, and diamond-paned leaded glass windows. Some of the inspiration came from designs the Greenes had seen in the U.S., but just as importantly, the Culbertson house evoked the English country homes Charles Greene had observed firsthand only a year earlier. For the interior of the Culbertson house, the Greenes incorporated an array of furnishings favored by arts and crafts enthusiasts in the U.S. Native American rugs and baskets, Tiffany lamps, and of course, craftsman furniture by Gustav Stickley. The interior of the Culbertson house was so fully in accord with arts and crafts values that Charles Greene could confidently invoke the name of William Morris, the famous leader of the arts and crafts movement in England. In a 1902 letter to James Culbertson, Greene professed that "I am in thorough sympathy with the William Morris movement. In fact, the whole of the inside is influenced by it in design." The Park Place neighborhood where the Culbertson house is located was to become a showcase for the Greenes. Over time, the brothers built 11 houses there, giving the neighborhood a unique character. And it isn't just the houses that distinguish Park Place. It's also the beautiful brick and cobblestone walls which create a richly varied yet unified streetscape.
The Greenes began to envision an entire streetscape at the Culbertson house and down the street on Arroyo Terrace, an entire streetscape made up of clinker bricks and boulders from the Arroyo. And that survives today, remarkably, almost completely intact.
In 1903, the firm of Greene Greene was 9 years old. That year, they undertook a project that was to vault them into national prominence. It was the Arturo Bandini House, also known as El Hogar, the hearth.
The man whom the house was made for, Don Arturo Bandini, was of the old Bandini family, one of the old ranchero families. And he wanted a house reminiscent of California and its simplicity, its rusticity.
The Greenes were challenged, therefore, to look to California itself for precedent.
The Greenes found the inspiration they needed in the U-shaped hacienda plan that was common during the Spanish colonial period. With this layout, they were also able to achieve a better integration of the house and garden, a prime goal of arts and crafts designers.
This was the turning point in their career. This was opening up the whole concept of the plan to the garden.
It was their first courtyard house, all of the rooms opening onto the courtyard, the side rooms not connecting to each other. To go from one side of the house to the other, you had to go outside. It was part of nature. There was in some ways no separation between the interior and the exterior. And it's interesting also how the Greenes kept returning to this theme of a house around a courtyard. You see that in some of their best house designs.
While reflecting California's Spanish heritage, the Bandini house also showed unmistakable Japanese influence.
It's the house where we see the Greenes feeling more and more free to bring together diverse cultures, the Japanese, the Spanish, other wood-building traditions. In particular, the Japanese tradition can be seen in the posts that sit on stones. Just weeks before the Bandini house design was begun, Charles Greene bought a copy of Edward Sylvester Morse's book, Japanese Homes and Their Surroundings. And illustrated in this book is this very device of the post that sits on a stone.
The simplicity and rustic charm of the Bandini house struck a deep chord in many observers and brought the Greenes wide attention.
When they first became known nationally, it wasn't for what they're known for today, the so-called high art of the arts and crafts. It was for their simplicity, their rusticity. And it all started with one house, the Arturo Bandini house. This house was the house more published than any other house at that time. Ladies' Home Journal, House Beautiful, the Craftsman magazine especially. It's as though they latched onto it as exemplary of the simple life.
Following the Bandini project, Henry Greene began building a home of his own. The residence presented a unique challenge, however, because it had to accommodate not only his immediate family, but also his mother-in-law, Charlotte Whitridge. The dual residence was necessitated by the fragile health of his wife, Emmeline, whom he had married in 1899. Emmeline suffered from deafness and other ailments, and her mother, Mrs. Whitridge, wanted to be nearby to assist her.
Although as a whole, it hangs together as a single family residence, once you know that there are two families living inside, it's easy to tell where those divisions take place.
A quiet and practical man, Henry Greene sought rational solutions to the challenges posed by the shared residence. The result was a solid, straightforward design with strong roof lines, deep eaves, and a minimum of detail.
It's a very elegant house, but it doesn't have the kind of freewheeling quirkiness of Charles's house that he designed for himself and his family. And so the two brothers' personalities can be seen in these two very different residences. They were, in fact, in a way, portraits of the two brothers.
As their homes reveal, the Greene brothers were a study in contrasts. Charles was intensely artistic, with a restless, romantic spirit and broad intellectual interests. Henry Greene, a year and a half his junior, had a more practical disposition. He was soft-spoken, well-organized, and dependable to a fault.
What I know about my grandfather, Henry, was that he was a gentle person and a very meticulous person and a very caring person. He really adored people. He loved his wife so dearly.
It was Charles who was the artistic lead in almost every case. But his musings, his dreaming, all of that was made possible because this brother opened the office on time every morning, supervised the draftsman, was a master of things technical. Charles was thus freed to be quite a free spirit in action as well as in mind.
Even with their complementary talents, the Greenes wouldn't have produced the master works for which they are famous without the guiding hand of their father.
It was the Greenes' father, Thomas Sumner Greene, who was most likely responsible for Charles and Henry becoming architects. He decided that his two young sons, even at a very early age, should be architects.
By encouraging his boys to work as a team, Thomas Greene was able to channel Charles's creative energies away from painting, which was his first love, and into the more practical field of architecture.
So these brothers were linked right from the beginning. They worked very well together eventually, and their talents were quite complementary. Papa Greene was right to insist that these boys work together, study together, and go out into the world together.
I've always felt that the Greenes worked at their best when they worked together. They knew each other's quirks and strengths and weaknesses, and they were completely sympathetic to each other in that regard. I think they not only loved each other, they loved what each other brought to the practice, to the architectural firm.
In 1904, the Greenes began a project that was to afford them a new level of artistic freedom. It was a house for Adelaide Tichenor, a prominent civic leader in Long Beach, California. Mrs. Tichenor was a woman of taste and means, and like Charles Greene, she had a passionate interest in Asian art.
In many ways, Adelaide Tichenor can be seen as the perfect client for the Greenes at the perfect moment. She was cultured, she was well-traveled.
While her house was still in the design stage, Mrs. Tichenor went to St. Louis to visit the 1904 Louisiana Purchase International Exposition. She was so excited by some of the exhibits that she urged Charles Greene to visit the fair before proceeding with her house. He agreed, and when he reached St. Louis, he too was deeply affected.
There were a lot of things to be seen at the fair that would have an influence on his later work and the work of the firm in general, including the Japanese pavilion, the Chinese pavilion.
I think that it's this first-hand experience that Charles had that created such a turning point. When he came back, you can see by the drawings that he did, he changed the roof line to be one of these Iramoya temple-style roof lines.
This reference to Japan is hardly surprising, given Charles Greene's strong interest in Asia. His first major exposure to Japanese culture occurred during his student days at MIT, when artists were excited by everything Japanese.
Charles was an artist, and at that time, when Japan came to America, the people it affected most were the artists. Japan at this time was something artistic, and this is what Charles wanted to be, and in many ways was.
The turning point that brought them closer to what we know today as the Greene and Greene style was that it was just as legitimate to look across the Pacific Ocean for inspiration towards Asia, to Japan and China, as it was to look back over their shoulders at Boston or Chicago or New York or Europe. And in fact, it is the Tichenor House that really decisively makes that irreversible step towards Asian design that characterizes their classic work of the later years.
The Tichenor project was all the more important because it afforded the Greenes their first opportunity to design an entire living environment, one in which the buildings, gardens, and furnishings would stand as an organic whole. In their designs for the Tichenor furniture, the Greenes broke new ground. While the influence of Gustav Stickley is still apparent, there is a lighter, more graceful quality to the work, inspired in part by Chinese domestic furniture. Furniture such as this table from the 16th century.
They chose the Chinese Ming Dynasty as their starting point, and what we now recognize as one of the classic elements in Greene and Greene houses, the Chinese cloud lift, appeared for the first time in the Tichenor furniture.
If the Tichenor project demonstrated Charles Greene's gift for design, it also revealed his artistic ego and the sometimes contentious relationships that developed between the Greenes and their clients. In this case, Charles Greene and Adelaide Tichenor clashed over issues of artistic control.
Over the years, the Greenes did experience the perhaps inevitable conflict between art and the client's wishes. The Greenes approached their architecture as a fine art, and their clients, whereas they may have understood that at an intellectual level, did not always appreciate it on the day-to-day level. Adelaide Tichenor was a good example of this.
There was always that tension of the client architect, her rushing him along when he wanted to take his time with the project, wanting to work it all the way through to get it just right. Charles, I think, always wanted to be the artist, working with a patron, more than he felt himself to be an architect, working with a client.
The Tichenor project exposed another problem that the Greenes would have to confront if they were to treat domestic architecture as a fine art. While their new furniture designs had considerable artistic merit, the workmanship left something to be desired. In fact, the craftsmen who executed the designs made technical mistakes that weakened some of the chairs. To realize their vision, the Greenes would have to find artisans whose skills and standards were equal to their own.
In 1904, the Greenes had the good fortune to meet John and Peter Hall, two Swedish brothers who were very skilled at cabinet making and construction. Finally, the level of building craft matched the level of design, and the Greenes' projects from this point forward took on an entirely new dimension.
When the Halls and the Greenes joined, it was the proverbial match made in heaven. I mean, it was absolutely incredible.
Jim Epekjian is a master craftsman who has restored Greene & Greene furnishings. He has a deep appreciation for the working relationship between the Greenes and the Halls.
The Halls built the structures, but they were also doing the furniture. They were also doing the lighting. All of the woodwork was in-house, in one central location, and it gave the Greenes a freedom that very few architects have ever had.
The collaboration with the Halls really took flight in 1905 with the design of the Henry and Laura Bell Robinson House in Pasadena. Robinson House was the first really big estate that the Greenes were commissioned to design. The Robinsons gave them carte blanche not only to design the house, but many of the furnishings for the interior.
With its graceful lines and pleasing symmetries, the Robinson House conveys a feeling of informality and naturalness, defying its size. The house is also noteworthy for its tapered buttresses and dash-coat stucco finish, which echo the work of the arts and crafts architect C.F.A. Voysey in England. The Robinson House was an important milestone for the Greenes because it was the first project in which they were able to work with the full ensemble of craftsmen who would help them realize their mature architectural vision.
So the essential team of people who could bring the Greenes' designs to full fruition now included John and Peter Hall, and also for the Robinson Commission, they brought on Emil Lang to execute the stained glass. A tremendous concentration of talent was brought to focus on this one house in a very short period of time.
By 1907, Charles and Henry Greene had a long list of clients, and their houses were widely published in national magazines. That year, the brothers began work on what would be the largest of their residential projects, a 12,000 square foot estate in Pasadena. It was for Robert Blacker and his wife Nellie, a couple from Michigan who had amassed a fortune in the lumber business. One of the most distinctive design features of the Blacker house is its massive porte-cochere, or covered entryway for automobiles. The imposing structure, with its boldly articulated timbers, establishes the sculptural character of the Blacker house.
I would hope that we would see sculpture in the Blacker house. I think much of their timber structures, much of their timber structure joinery is sculpture.
I like to think of Greene & Greene as structural expressionists because of how they express the apparent structure of the house, in that we see large timbers, we see rafter tails extending out way beyond the walls of the house, and those timbers are sculpted and placed in a way that is very deliberate.
It was the first house that made extensive use of exotic hardwoods, mahogany from Honduras, teak from Burma.
The entry hall is amazing. It's teak. In it, there is an example of all of the different joints, all of the tricks that they used for softening edges. It's all there. I had a hands-on involvement in its restoration. In those 2 years, there weren't very many days that would go by when I didn't notice something new, a different detail. It's something that I've found to be true in most of the Greene and Greene houses that no matter how many times you go back, there's something else new to see. And it brings a sense of discovery that is really remarkable.
As part of the restoration, Jim Apekjian recreated several pieces of furniture that the Greenes designed specifically for the Blacker house.
The Greenes in the halls never took the easy way out. They would design and fabricate in a way that appeared to be simple, but in reality, from a construction standpoint, was fairly complex.
In the case of chair construction, they utilized a housed mortise and tenon joint, not only including the tenon and the mortise, but a secondary pocket that allowed the entire rail to fit into the leg, contributing to the strength and eliminating any possibility of a gap opening up from seasonal movement. This leg and rail assembly, when placed into this example of a dining room chair going into the Blacker house dining room, creates a structure that, like the original, will last many generations.
The Blacker house was the first in a series of large and richly appointed wooden houses that the Greenes designed between 1907 and 1910. To many observers, these remarkable residences, often called the ultimate bungalows, represent the high point in the Greenes' efforts to raise domestic architecture to the level of fine art. Another of the ultimate bungalows was created for David Gamble, a prominent figure in the Procter & Gamble Company. Today, the Gamble House is the only Greene & Greene residence in which most of the original furnishings are still in place. The Gamble House is even more important because it is the only example of the Greenes' work that is open to the public. It has been preserved as an historic landmark under an agreement between the city of Pasadena and the University of Southern California, which administers it. For many people, entering the Gamble House is a deeply affecting experience. That's certainly true for Randall Mackinson, who helped preserve the residence and served as its first director.
I can go back to the house today and I am still awed by the quality of detail, by the quality of light. When the sun rises and comes through those stained glass front doors and the shadows are across the rug, it's an exhilarating experience. And no matter how many times you've been there, it still is uplifting. It still moves you inside.
My personal response to the entry hall of the Gamble House is that it is one of the most transcendently beautiful spaces in American domestic architecture. It's always a near spiritual experience to walk through the front door and to have it close behind me. I feel as though I've entered a different world entirely. For the Greenes, I believe that structure was the basis of their design philosophy. And it's clear from their classic work that wood was their favorite medium. One of the reasons that the wood draws so much attention to itself here is that we are so used to seeing wood joinery concealed behind the walls. Here, the Greenes have elected to celebrate it. It's tempting even to think of the Greenes as sculptors first and architects second. And in fact, in their training, they did learn wood carving first before they learned anything about the technical aspects of architecture. This explains a lot about why their houses look the way they look.
As teenagers, Charles and Henry Greene attended the manual training school at Washington University in St. Louis, the first manual training school in the United States.
The Greenes' exposure to woodworking craft and learning the basic techniques at the manual training school certainly gave them the opportunity to strive for the highest in that craft.
One of the most remarkable aspects of the house is the extent to which the Greenes were able to achieve a fully integrated living environment.
Like other architects of the very early 20th century, Frank Lloyd Wright, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, Joseph Hoffman. The Greenes began to be interested in the design of the total environment. And here, in fact, in the living room of the Gamble House, where I'm sitting right now, they had that freedom and the ability to pursue every single square inch of this space. The rugs, the fireplace tools, the chairs, all not only are designed for this space, but are designed to work with each other in this space.
The next of the so-called ultimate bungalows brought a new challenge to the Greenes. After years of designing houses for suburban sites, they were confronted with a rural setting. In this case, the beautiful oak and chaparral-covered hills of Ojai, California. This house, called Casa Barranca, was to be a country home for Charles Pratt, a high-ranking executive in the Standard Oil Company, and his wife, Mary Seymour Pratt. The charm of the Pratt house begins with its sensitive relationship to the site.
Part of the reason the Pratt house seems to fit so perfectly into its rural site is the way the roof line seems to echo beautifully the peaks of the Topa Topa Mountains behind it. The materials used in the house come from the land nearby, and in particular the stones that make up the massive chimney. It's the same stone that you see on the acreage around the house itself.
Charles Greene's hands-on approach to the art of architecture can be seen in the stonework for the Pratt house. Instead of laying out the design on paper, he personally supervised the placement of stones at the site.
When Pratt wrote to complain about the cost of some stonework Charles had done, Charles wrote back to him that I did not think it advisable to make plans of the walls and terraces because it would be impossible to take advantage of the natural contours. So I personally directed the work and carefully selected and placed the largest stones to harmonize with the surroundings.
Like the other ultimate bungalows, the Pratt house celebrates the beauty and magic of wood.
And this is a wooden house built woodenly. You go into the master bedroom and the floors are wood, the walls are wood, the ceilings wood, the trusses wood, the doors and windows, all wood.
Of the many artistic details in the Pratt house, one of the more interesting is a door that was designed by Henry Greene. It shows a strongly modernist sensibility and is reminiscent of the work of Charles Rennie Mackintosh in Scotland.
It is a linear composition, but it is so carefully proportioned that it's really a piece of sculpture which can stand on its own. It's marvelous, just marvelous.
Charles and Henry Greene had barely begun designing the Pratt house when they received a commission for another large residence, this time in Berkeley, California. It came from William and Carolyn Thorsen, who selected the Greenes over a host of prominent architects then practicing in the San Francisco Bay Area.
It turned out Mrs. Thorsen was the sister of Nellie Blacker, and she really did say to her husband and the architects, I want a house like my sister Nellie's house in Pasadena.
Mrs. Thorsen was conscious of the fact that her sister had a work of art in Pasadena, that the Blacker house was more than just a dwelling. And she wanted some of that art for herself and her family.
The Thorsens chose a site near the University of California that offers a commanding vista of San Francisco Bay.
The William R. Thorsen house was the last of what we sometimes refer to as the ultimate bungalows, but it was the first of them to be built on an urban site. And this created a new challenge for the Greenes.
The house is rather close to the sidewalk, so the house rises up from the earth rather abruptly, and there are large retaining walls of clinker brick. It has a front stairway, a double stairway that is actually very monumental. It's as monumental in some ways as the gigantic porte-cochere on the Blacker house.
The massive clinker brick stairway helps separate the residence from the street. It also anchors the house on the site and contributes to a feeling of refined rusticity. The Greenes responded to local conditions in still other ways. Because of the cooler, wetter climate of Northern California, they increased the pitch of the gable roofs, while also reducing the depth of the eaves. Despite the modifications, the Thorsen house is pure green and green. From the extended timbers and rafter tails, to the rounded posts and beams, and the artistic ironwork in the rear courtyard. The Greenes drew upon the same design vocabulary for the interior of the Thorsen house that they employed in the other ultimate bungalows. In the entry hall, for example, leaded art glass windows add warmth and bring a touch of nature into the house. While in the dining room, the fireplace is enlivened by exposed joinery and inlaid tiles in an abstract floral pattern. Of the many visual surprises found in the Thorsen house, one of the most striking is the rear gate.
That, to me, is the work of Henry, using the forms that Charles had invented, but making it into a beautifully modulated abstract composition.
In 1909, with houses going up in several locations across California, Charles and Henry Greene were at the peak of their creative powers. Early that year, they received confirmation of their stature in the world of architecture. It came in the person of Charles Robert Ashby, a prominent English architect and designer, and a leader of the arts and crafts movement in England. Ashby was touring America, and he came to Pasadena to observe the Greenes' work firsthand.
He stopped by to visit Charles Greene, and they drove around together and looked at some of the Greenes' work, and Ashby commented later in his journal that it was the finest work that he'd seen in the United States, that the quality of craftsmanship and design was, as he put it, quite up to the best English standards.
Ashby had more to say about Charles Greene in his diary, including a comparison between Greene and Frank Lloyd Wright. "I think C. Sumner Greene's work beautiful, among the best there is in this country," Ashby wrote. Like Frank Lloyd Wright, the spell of Japan is on him, but there is in his work more tenderness, more subtlety than in Wright's work. It is more refined and has more repose. Ashby's visit raises an intriguing issue. That is, the relationship of the Greenes to the arts and crafts movement. Clearly, both brothers were influenced by it, and they also benefited from it. Yet they never actively participated in the movement. They pursued an independent course, rejecting limiting ideologies and keeping their creative options open.
I don't think that they consciously associated themselves with any particular movement. They really wanted to create beautiful houses and beautiful interiors and works of art. That's what they were about.
They took the arts and crafts aesthetic and bumped it up quite a few notches. They were able to establish an aesthetic that makes a reference to the arts and crafts movement, but definitely moves beyond the arts and crafts.
If Charles Greene had reached a high level of achievement and acclaim by 1909, he had also become restless. Years of intense work had taken a toll, leaving him exhausted and in need of creative renewal. Not long after Ashby's visit, he made the decision to go abroad. After turning all responsibility for the business over to Henry, he put his family on a transatlantic liner and sailed for England. Once in London, the Greenes rented a townhouse in West Kensington. For the next several months, Charles traveled in England and on the continent, sketching and photographing subjects that interested him. He relished the time spent painting and drawing, and he also enjoyed the opportunity to study architectural history firsthand.
I believe that he was in a kind of midlife crisis mode where he was reassessing what it was that he wanted to do with his creativity. And I think that he wanted to explore writing and painting. He realized that he had an artistic drive deep inside of him that could not be entirely satisfied by the practice of architecture.
So when Charles returned to Pasadena in 1909, he was a changed person. He had a new dimension historically and architecturally.
Even before Charles returned from England in 1909, a significant shift had already taken place within the office. Henry was an able architect, a very competent one, and when left to his own devices, was able to create several beautiful homes without the assistance of his brother.
Henry Greene's mastery of scale and proportion can be seen in the Spinks house. The chalet-style gabled roof is balanced by the asymmetrical design of the front porch, as well as by the timbered portico that projects boldly from one corner of the house. In 1911, with Henry busy in Pasadena, Charles Greene agreed to supervise a project for the firm in Woodside, a small town south of San Francisco. It was the house for Mortimer Fleischacker, a successful businessman and patron of the arts. Fleischacker wanted an English-style residence, and Charles found the prospect appealing, especially after his recent travels in England. He also welcomed an opportunity to try his hand at new materials. Later, in 1927, Charles Greene would return to the Fleischacker estate to create a remarkable water garden. Designed in an Italian style, it reveals his continuing love affair with stone.
While Charles and Henry Greene are most identified with their work in wood, there is no question that Charles had an affair with stone, the likes of which is equal to anything that they did in wood. This is truly an exercise in stone. He even makes the flower pots out of stones. It's a piece of stone sculpture that is truly magnificent.
In 1915, while touring Northern California by car, Charles and Alice Greene discovered the picturesque town of Carmel by the sea. Charles was excited by Carmel's lively artistic community, and he imagined himself living there, leading the kind of artistic and contemplative life he had long desired. A year later, he and Alice made the decision to leave Pasadena and move to Carmel.
It was a time that he could pick and choose the type of work he wanted to do. He could spend time reading and writing, working on his poetry or his painting.
Taking up his new life in Carmel, Charles Greene was determined to set architecture aside and devote himself to writing. But his writing career didn't materialize as he imagined. What's more, architecture wasn't yet out of his blood. One of his most spectacular projects lay ahead: the D.L. James House. D.L. James was a China merchant from Kansas City who owned a lot in the highlands south of Carmel. Given an opportunity to build a house for James on the dramatic site, Charles Greene leapt at it.
As Herbert Crowley would have said in the architectural record, he was building a house on a site that had been waiting for that particular architecture from the day that nature had created the site.
There was no dividing point between what was nature-made and what was man-made. It was not just rising from the cliff, it was part of the cliff.
For the D.L. James House, Charles Greene set aside his earlier articulated wood style and sought inspiration in historical precedents favored by the arts and crafts movement, especially Romanesque architecture of the Middle Ages. Interestingly, he incorporated a stone arch similar to one he had painted at Tintagel Castle in England only a few years earlier. The result is a house with a feeling of antiquity and an almost monastic calm, reflecting his deepening involvement in spiritual study.
One feels walking up to this house that it's been here for hundreds of years. There's something about this house, its peacefulness, its tranquility, its placement on the landscape, that you feel that Charles was trying to achieve with all of his other work building up to this. You can see this, in a way, as the culmination of his career.
With the James Project, Charles Greene had a chance to practice architecture in the deliberate, artistic manner he desired. Just as importantly, he was able to honor his highest values. Values such as one expressed by Ralph Waldo Emerson in an essay on art, which Charles underlined. "Beauty must come back to the useful arts," wrote Emerson. "In nature, all is useful. All is beautiful." For his own family, Charles Greene built a simple board and batten house on a wooded site in Carmel. In 1923, he added a studio of recycled brick, crafting much of it with his own hands. Once finished, the studio became Charles Greene's sanctuary, a place where he could pursue both his art and his deepening spiritual interests.
This was a refuge. This was his lair. He read a great deal, rather esoteric books, philosophy of all sorts, and he meditated until late at night. If it was during meditation time, you didn't come until he finished meditating.
Charles Greene decorated his Carmel studio with a great profusion of symbols, representing diverse aspects of his spiritual exploration.
In the front of the hall here, there's what looks very like the Star of David. Look at this case behind me. That has definitely a wave motif on the bottom. Look up here, there's seagulls, there's a crab. So he was interested in symbolism in a wide kind of a way.
If Charles Greene had a desire to take his architecture in new directions, so too did Henry Greene. In 1929, Henry accepted the challenge of working with adobe brick in what would be his last major project, the Walter Richardson House. Walter Richardson operated a citrus ranch in Porterville, California. Knowing the Greenes from previous business dealings in Pasadena, he asked Henry to create a house out of adobe brick, which was to be fabricated at the site by his ranch hands.
Adobe was a material he did not know, and knowing Grandpa, I am certain that he was intrigued and curious about adobe, because that's kind of a gentleman he was. All his life he was intrigued and curious about new things.
The Richardson House is located on an ancient Native American site, a place called Tenaloo by the indigenous people who once used the many grinding stones that dot the area. Henry Greene further accentuated the historical dimension of the house by choosing a U-shaped plan with an interior courtyard, which evokes memories not only of the earlier Arturo Bandini house, but also of haciendas from the Spanish colonial period.
The house looks like it grows from its site as if it had really always been here. I have no doubt that Henry envisioned that when he was figuring out how to create the joining of the house to the land.
That house, to me, shows that the spiritual qualities that we often associate with Charles Greene were very evident in Henry Greene. Here was a house that applied complete organic principles to its site, drew the materials from the site, to create a piece of architecture that, to me, is some of the most honest work created by either of the Greene brothers, and really one of the most beautiful houses in California.
The Richardson House would be Henry Greene's last major project. It was a fitting capstone to his career, one that demonstrated both his artistry and his command of materials, just as the D.L. James House had displayed his brother's prowess. With these two houses, which stand as their final architectural statements, Charles and Henry Greene achieved a union of site and structure, beauty and function, art and architecture that is both rare and remarkable.
In 1915, Charles Greene wrote a magazine article called Architecture as a Fine Art. One might reasonably ask if it's appropriate for architecture to be viewed as a fine art. For the Greenes, the answer had to be yes. The result is, happily, here for us to see today.
Major funding for Greene & Greene, the Art of Architecture, has been provided by the Amundsen Foundation, the James Irvine Foundation, the Ayrshire Foundation, and the Joan Irvine Smith and Athley R. Clark Foundation.